This is House Planning Help episode 5.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future, build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and it's the last in our mini-series on the Passivhaus Standard. My guest is Adam Dadabai from Passivhaus Homes and co-author of the Passivhaus Handbook. And why a chimney triggered an argument in my household.
HousePlanningHelp.com.
Thank you for downloading yet again. I am honoured. It's so nice to have you here. And I've got loads that I want to tell you as well. I don't want to overload you here, but I've made a major blunder already, barely into my research here, which I must tell you about in a few moments, over a chimney that we're going to talk about. Also, some interesting feedback from our survey. And I'm going cycling between eco homes tomorrow, which I hope to report back on. So first, the major blunder. I should have seen this coming. I don't know why I didn't. It's entirely my fault as well, which I suppose makes it more bearable. I've made the mistake. But as I've been going about researching this house, it's been very much my house and how I would like things and my learning. It's my podcast. And that's where I've gone majorly wrong, because I'm married and it can't be like that. So we were travelling in the car the other day and my wife has suddenly started showing an interest, which I suppose is fair enough because we're going to be living in this house together, and has decided to tell me what she actually wants from the house, which in a way was always what I wanted from a house. So we thought we'd never see any issues between what we would like. But then I've tried to keep an open mind about what we should be doing with housing in the future. The whole point of the podcast is looking at better ways that we can do things, and if we are stuck in a way of thinking, then working out why do we want to do it that way. And so I'm actually married to someone who wants to do it all to have an old-fashioned viewpoint on it. So I've got my work cut out, and this spiraled into a point where I was saying, well, we can always retrofit an old property. Those sorts of situations will always be needed because the housing stock is never static, and so those opportunities will come up. We need to preserve, particularly in the UK, we've got some great history here. But unfortunately, I mentioned about how it would have to be airtight, and that would mean that we would have no chimney or no active fire there. And suddenly this became the one thing that she wanted, that it was very important to sit down in front of the fire. A stove won't do? No, nothing. So yeah, I think we've got quite a bit of learning to do. The good news is, now that we're embracing this together, we're going to our first show, and it's the Home Building and Renovation magazine. They put on shows in the UK all over. So we're going together to experience it together, and then hopefully to collate our ideas together. So that's just quite funny. But another idea that I'm trying to push is the scrapbook idea. I went to see some of Pat Wilkinson's clients the other day. He was a guest on the podcast a little while back, and I loved this scrapbook that they did. They put together a scrapbook of all the ideas that they wanted about their new house, just even if it's materials or pictures that they like, and it creates a bit of a feel. And for me, the most interesting part of this, although it was all heading in one direction, they've completely done a U-turn and decided, well, actually, we can see the sense of where we're trying to build and what we're trying to do now. So I think if we embrace this together as a couple, maybe we can go further. I can't believe I've been talking about this for the last couple of minutes. But anyway, if you're in a similar situation, don't fall into that trap, okay? Also, while we mentioned Home Building and Renovation magazine, I've had a nice link up with them, and I'm going to be doing updates on their website, just letting their readers know about what we're doing on the podcast and where we go from here, which I will tell you what our main content is today. Then there was the survey. I asked last time round whether you just have a couple of minutes spare to help me out, and so I could find out more about you. And I had that sneaking suspicion, didn't I, that a lot of you were industry insiders, and I was proved right. I still want more people to get on and do that survey, if that's at all possible, just because I feel the more feedback I get, the more representative it is for you all. But that was interesting, and I wonder whether it will stay that way. I think I've just got to continue down the channel that I'm going down and the research that I decide to do, and we'll see what audience we end up with. But some great ideas of where the podcast could go as well. And I know that one of the things that seemed to be repeated was you wanted more case studies with people who've actually been there and done it. Those self-builders, those custom builders who commissioned it. So we'll definitely go down that route. I mean, all of these things we want to cover. It's just a matter of when we get to it. Again, that address, houseplanninghelp.com/survey. And I'm excited about heading to Kent tomorrow. This is a little jolly I'm heading on with some of my AECB friends. We're going cycling between eco homes. So if they allow me to take any pictures, I'll get them onto the website or tweet them. But Kent is where I grew up in the UK, and it's also where I did a lot of radio presenting, so I know that area well. The Garden of England, if you get the right bits, the Patio of England if you don't. But I'm hoping we're going between the villages and some lovely back routes, so that's going to be good. I'll let you know of any learnings as and when. It's time to meet our guest for this session, and we've been learning about the Passivhaus standard. I've tried to look at it from a few perspectives. That's why Dr. Wolfgang Feist, obviously a very knowledgeable man who's put in lots of research. He's a physicist by profession, but really I think he's taken on quite a high-profile role to try and move this on and to let it filter down, firstly to the construction industry and then to the public and their awareness. So that's been very interesting. And I'm still not sure how much the public know about insulation and airtightness, and I put myself in that group too up until a few months ago. Pat Wilkinson from Touchwood Homes, that was again really good, a builder's perspective, the precision that's needed, the concerns that tradesmen here in the UK don't really have the skills. We need, perhaps it's an opportunity too to get people up to those skilled levels that's needed. And then today, a man who's retrofitted a property in Totnes and got it certified to the Passivhaus standard. I suppose this is quite unusual because retrofitting to the Passivhaus standard is incredibly difficult, and there are all sorts of challenges, as we'll find out from our guest in a few moments. And I think at the time there were only 2 other properties in the UK, both in London, that had reached the Passivhaus standard. These are retrofit properties, so this is going to be fascinating. And Adam Dadabai is also a certified Passivhaus consultant, and he's co-written a new book called The Passivhaus Handbook. All sorts to find out about, but what I like, next time I'm in the West Country, I'm going to be stopping by. Let's find out why.
houseplanninghelp.com.
It's time for our featured interview this week, and I'm chatting to Adam Dadabai. And you are from Passivhaus Homes, aren't you? And you live in a Passivhaus home.
That's correct, yes.
So I've got loads I want to ask you. Should we just go for it? First of all, your Passivhaus home is a little bit different because it doubles up as a bed and breakfast.
That's correct, yes. We've got a very small one-room bed and breakfast, and we came across the idea of doing that towards the end of our build, partly because we had set up a business to design and build passive houses for other people, and we knew ourselves as clients that we hadn't had a chance to try it out, and is it any different, what are the differences? So it's actually been really successful because people, they really want to try before they buy.
So who are the main people who are trying this? Are they clients, as you say, or do you get interest from other areas?
They're people who are either their clients or they're architects, because obviously architects need to understand what it is all about, because their clients will ask them. Or academics are the third group we've had come and stay. So people who are doing research into low energy housing, maybe not specifically Passivhaus, but obviously Passivhaus is part of the low energy housing scene.
When did you first become interested in Passivhaus, or how was it introduced to you?
Well, I was studying at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales at Huntleth. Passivhaus was touched on in brief during the course, and it immediately caught my attention because it was very focused on quite a narrow goal. So not excluding other sustainability issues, but focusing on energy and use, which to me seemed very important. And also it was very driven by science and evidence and practice of what worked. It wasn't ideological or driven by a belief system. It was just driven by the pragmatics and driven by what the numbers tell you. So, and also the other thing I really liked about it, as well as being having a scientific focus, it was also really thinking about how people use buildings and how occupants behave in buildings, and it tries to address, or it recognises some of the human issues in building a house, because Passivhaus is all about detail and quality, so building things accurately. That requires a certain mindset amongst your team of people on site.
Was this something that you were led to almost? Because presumably in your career you had a certain amount of time beforehand. I'm just really interested about why you've stopped at Passive House and not considered any other options, or perhaps you have. Maybe you could tell me.
Yes. Well, actually, I didn't. I sort of got off topic with the last question. So at the Centre for Alternative Technology, we did look at the whole range of different sustainability approaches. So it's not that I've kind of rejected all the others, but I was particularly drawn to Passive House when I learned about it.
What others are there? Sorry, maybe you could just tell me.
Some focus on carbon more than energy in terms of its resource use during the lifetime of the building. Others focus on natural materials, low embodied energy, low impact materials. Others will focus maybe on gadgetry and technology, which even though, I have my gadget moments, I think most people don't, and it's not really the true focus of a building. The building actually is about the structure itself, and all the gadgetry you put in are relatively short-life add-ons. So if we build for low carbon, the UK has a scheme called the Code for Sustainable Homes, which some of your listeners probably know about, and that's initially has focused very much on carbon and
I was going to interject just there.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Will they have to change this in future? Because there is a time limit that they've set at the moment for this zero carbon.
That's right, yeah, it's 2016. Yes, I think that the Code for Sustainable Homes is going through a change. I think there's a recognition now that focusing purely on carbon isn't really good enough, because you end up with still a relatively inefficient building plastered with lots of PV and a wood chip boiler that no one knows how to use or service. So the Passive House approach is to address the fabric to get the building to demand as little as possible. The choice of how you then provide that little heat that is required is a secondary consideration after you've got the fabric right. So Code for Sustainable Homes is beginning to move in that direction, in that it has brought in a fabric energy efficiency standard, which is, I think, as we record this now, its status is not yet official, but I think it's moving in that direction. So alongside the Code for Sustainable Homes, there is also the AECB have their own standards, AECB Silver and Gold, which are much more fabric focused, and so the AECB Silver is a sort of halfway house to Passive House, but it's still a challenging standard, and it's one that's worth aiming for, depending on your budget and your situation. There's also Enefit, which is another Passive House standard for retrofit buildings. Retrofitting to the full Passive House standard is very hard. So the Passive House Institute introduced last year the Enefit standard, which is a bit less demanding, but still a challenge. It's not easy to achieve.
Going back to your sustainability course, was there anything in a passive house that you weren't sure of? For example, insulation, sometimes there can be questions about how green insulation is.
Yes, that's true. And I think personally, if you were doing a new build, I would want to use natural and low embodied energy and low impact materials wherever possible. On our own house, we used a mixture of sheep's wool, insulation, warm cell, which is a product name for recycled newspaper that's been treated for fire. But we also used fossil fuel based phenolic foam insulation. But actually you find in retrofits, that's the place where you do sometimes end up using less sustainable insulation, because you have such severe space constraints imposed on you by the existing structure. So you may only have 100 mil to achieve insulation, or 50 mil. In a new build you might have 200 mil, so you can use a less thermally efficient but more benign material in a new build, where in a retrofit sometimes you're having to, not always, but you're having to make a decision between the maybe less sustainable aspects of the material and choosing a more sustainable material, but one which doesn't perform as well or adequately to achieve the energy standards you're aiming for. I mean, the thing I like about Passive House, though, is that you're making those choices very explicitly. So it's not a dogma saying you have to use a certain material or you have to go down a certain route, but by modelling the design in a piece of software called the PHPP, a Passive House Planning Package, you get transparency, you get visibility of what the impact of different choices are. So you can tweak the design and choose different materials, choose different designs, and you get an instant impression of how that will affect the energy performance. So you can make a decision. Maybe unless you're going for a certified passive house, you can say, well, I'm only going to go for 25 kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, which is the way that they measure the efficiency of the building, the number of kilowatt hours per square metre of floor area, of useful floor area per year. So the passive house standard is 15, which is hard to achieve. You might go for 25. The AECB Silver standard is 40, But all of those are way better than a typical UK building, which is sort of in the low hundreds potentially. So,
in terms of the regulations, what are the current regulations, or is it because they're measured in a different way?
They're measured in a different way. It's very hard to compare. And this is the problem when people are sort of coming to this new and they're saying, well, should I do a house like this? It's almost impossible to compare, really, because even if you can convert one system into another, there are so many assumptions behind the unit of measure that are not necessarily made explicit. So it is a bit of a minefield. Will the playing field level in the future? Is that something that might happen naturally so that people can compare these things? Well, it could do. There's no reason why it couldn't. But there needs to be a certain amount of regulation and standards and all these boring things that people think as being unnecessarily burdensome. But for example, in the UK, we don't really have a single agreed convention for how you measure floor area. So when you're looking at energy use per square metre of floor area or carbon per square metre of floor area, unless you've agreed a standard way that you measure floor area for buildings. So everyone's doing it differently? Well, I think someone counted 4 different methods in the UK. So there's, without going to... Don't worry, this is what I'm trying to learn. Yeah. Okay, 4 different ways. So again, in Germany, they have fits the stereotype a little bit, but there is a kind of a way that you measure floor area, and that's how everyone learns. That's about right, isn't it? So, but there is it is a stereotype, but actually in this situation, it's really useful to have a single way to do things, because then you're comparing. It's the same reason why we have a metric system or a unit of measure of anything that is agreed how you define it. It's tricky, but the starting point is really the principles you're aiming for. So, and also your situation and your budget, and if you're living in a city, it's different than if you're living in the countryside. So where I live in Devon, a lot of people like to use wood to heat, which is fine in Devon. But if you're living in a city, it's just not practical for everyone to burn wood. And even if they do choose to burn wood, it isn't necessarily very low carbon because it might have travelled quite a long way. Well, let's talk about the house that you have built, because that's obviously something that you will have a lot of information about. First of all, did you have a clear brief of what you wanted out of your house? Yes, absolutely. And I was speaking to somebody this week who has a small amount of money to do a bit of work on a house, and I said the brief is everything, because if you don't really know what you want yourself at the beginning, you'll be led by the architect and builder, because someone has to decide in the end. And that's fine if you're happy to go with whatever is suggested to you, but it really is worth developing the brief, taking time to do research. The more time you spend planning and researching and designing, and the less time you spend on site, the less risk there is of overspending and of not getting to where you want to at the end. So it's so easy during the build itself to get led down the wrong path, because you're making decisions under pressure, you're tired, you're stressed. This is the same for any build, really, whether it's a passive house, low energy build, or a normal standard build. When do you know to trust yourself then? Because a lot of people that will be listening will be coming from the point of view of they're trying to get their knowledge up. But when do you say, no, I know what's best, compared to the contractor? Well, I think if you've chosen your contractor well, then you have to respect that they are professionals, they have years of experience of doing what they're doing. So it's a bit like getting any kind of professional advice. The professional knows their field, you know your particular circumstances better, and you have to balance those two. But you have to, I would say as a client, as an ex-client of a project, you have to choose your moments carefully so you're not effectively saying to your builder or architect, look, I know better how to do your job than you do. But at the same time, you don't want to be taken down a road just because it may be easier. I mean, sometimes it's good to choose the easier path, because if you keep on making things harder for the builder, then obviously you're adding costs to yourself. He's not going to be doing it out of the goodness of his heart. So, what was in your brief? I can't remember now, to be honest, the exact words I used, but it specifically stated that we wanted to get a certification for the Passive House standard. I gave an indication of the size of accommodation we wanted and what it was going to be used for. We also indicated something about our aesthetic tastes and what we wanted. And we indicated our budget as well, how much money we had to spend. Probably some other stuff, but I can't remember all the other things now.
What were the challenges then along the way, or can you lead us through the process, how long it took? I guess being an insider takes you a long way anyway.
Well, I think the biggest decision was to decide to refurbish and extend the house rather than build new. With the knowledge I have now, I would probably have chosen to build new. That's mainly because it's so much more complex, retrofitting, and my choice to retrofit was driven by a belief that we needed to save and reuse materials. And the house that we bought had an awful lot of concrete in it, so it was 40 years old. And we have actually retained most of that concrete in the build, but if it had been knocked down, it wouldn't have gone into landfill, it would have been reused for building materials. So there would have to have been a further input of energy into removing it off the site, scrunching it all up and reformulating it again. So you could argue we've saved a bit of embodied energy by retrofitting, but the problems were much more complex, and you end up with most retrofits having to make some compromises. We didn't make very many, but then obviously there's a financial impact of that as well. So, and the financial side as well, of course, is very much skewed in favour of new build because you can claim all the construction cost VAT back. So effectively, all the construction costs are zero rated if it's a new build, and you pay VAT at the full rate for most things if you're doing a retrofit. And to me, that's one of the big policy changes, that we need to really link the VAT rate to the energy performance of the final building. A small tweaking of that, which could be revenue neutral overall, would provide a huge incentive to build low energy buildings. So, for example, passive house is more expensive than a normal house. All other things being equal, if you've built to the same standard of finish, you might be paying an extra 5 or 10% for a passive house. So it's not a huge extra amount relative to the swings in property prices and land prices. It's a small factor, but obviously people don't want to pay extra. People are very focused on the upfront cost.
I was just about to say, it's always upfront, isn't it? Because you're bound to make big savings over time, which is one of your motivations for doing it. But it seems to deter people and scare people having that initial outlay. Yeah. Do you think there's anything that, or any way that the governments could step in and help here? You've mentioned one, I suppose.
Well, I suppose the VAT, yes. If the VAT, even you'd only need a small difference in VAT to eliminate that cost difference. The second thing is training. I think if there was a national training scheme to address airtightness and teach builders a little bit about the physics of why it's important not to leave gaps in insulation, because I think that builders will do the right thing if they can see a reason to do it. Most builders I've spoken to who are sceptical about the need to worry about putting insulation in properly, they don't really know why and what the impact financially for their customers is. So I think if that was conveyed at the training stage, that would probably help. The other things are more cultural, to do with our perceptions about, as you were saying, people are very scared of upfront costs. If you think about people's satellite TV subscription or mobile phone subscription, or even buying a printer, the capital cost is made really low, but then you pay a lot every month, and that's because people never can tend to think very far into the future. So there's a cultural need for a mindset change, and it's interesting talking to people who are thinking about passive house. Some of them just say, "Well, I don't know that I'm going to move out of the house again within a few years," and then you have to ask yourself, why are you putting yourself through all this stress if you're only going to live in the house for 5 years afterwards? This is something to do with a longer time period, in mind, in my opinion. And then the other thing as well, I think, is yes, you will, that 5% or 5 to 10% extra is extra money up front, but you get the savings on the bills, you get less maintenance because there's less heating and hot water infrastructure than in a normal house, and you also have a really nice house to live in. It's just really comfortable. The air quality is really nice. It's lovely and quiet. So if you're on a busy road, the windows are closed. It's quiet. It's peaceful. All those things are worth something. And if you're buying something else, I don't know, a computer or a car, you don't always just go for the absolute cheapest. Unless you're on a really tight budget. If you've got any kind of financial discretion at all, you'll be buying it somewhere between the cheapest and the most expensive. So why do we feel for houses we always have to just go for the absolute cheapest when it's stuff that we're going to have to live with then for years and years? So specifying even a thing like a tap or a shower screen that fails after 3 years and you're having to replace it, why not just spend a bit more, get something that's going to last long enough And it's greener as well, because this stuff ends up in being recycled or in a land.
Funny you should say that. I've got a little story. I've just been and had my hair cut, and the barber where I get my hair cut, he's a real character. He's called Graham. Mm-hmm. And he was telling me how his house, he's the traditional old-fashioned energy efficient, where he doesn't heat it. He's got dogs that provide the heat. But he was telling me about how he will often go to the tip and find various different bits and pieces that he can use to create stuff. People that have thrown items away, he can use again, a form of recycling. But he's saying always the stuff that he goes and collects tends to be the old items that were built to last.
Yeah.
Why can't we do that?
Yes, absolutely. No, it's true. It's funny, I've got to the point now where, if something is getting a bit towards the end of its life, I just think, is it actually worth replacing this? Because whatever I buy won't last very long. If I just treat it carefully or keep it going for a bit longer, it might well outlast the new thing that I buy to replace it.
Well, hopefully there are enough people that do want to do things properly that we can return to that way of thinking. I believe that things do go around full circle, but we've definitely for the last few years been in that build it and it'll crash and burn in a couple of years. Let's get back to you, because I know that you've written a book. So maybe you could just tell us what the focus of this is and when it's going to be out. Well,
the book is called The Passivhaus Handbook. It's a book really for all of those who are thinking of building a passive house, either for themselves or for clients, it's architects. So it's meant for the interested generalist who wants to be informed to quite a detailed level. But it's also got enough detail for someone who's working in the construction sector. So architects, engineers, planners, builders. And it's published by Green Books. And what else can I tell you about it? 240 pages long.
What's on those 240 pages?
It's got a mixture of practical advice on how you actually go about doing the project and selecting architects, builders, a bit about the technical side of Passive House. It talks a little bit about Passive House in the wider UK context of other building standards. There's a little section on policy, on what we think should change policy-wise. The book I've co-written it with my colleague Janet Cotterill, who is a REBA architect. She was the architect who designed my house as well. So it's very much got two flavours to it. It's got the flavour of someone who's worked in the fields for many years, then my take, which is a little bit more that of the client and someone who's new to the sector. So we also have a chapter on what it's like to live in a passive house. So I've referred to a few projects and feedback from people living in it, because that's in the end is where what you want to know. What's it like after you've gone through all the trouble of building a very special house or home?
Well, we've had some great information today. One final thing. What are your top 3 tips?
Well, we talked before about the brief and being clear about your brief, but also not changing your brief. Not changing your brief is a good idea on any project, but much more so on a passive house, because the implications of changing your brief, they ripple through the whole build and the whole structure. And so because, for example, you have ducting systems that run through the house, that might have an impact. There are going to be lots of little changes that you can't recognise that result from your decision to change some element of the brief, which will affect the energy performance of the building. The other thing as well is the human factor. You're asking this team of people to really concentrate and build something accurately and to a high standard. And then especially if you're on site, because there are stories of someone's half fitted a kitchen and they say, "Oh no, I wanted to move it over there," and it's very dispiriting for the person doing the work. They're putting all their attention and effort into doing something right. And then they're just told to undo it all and start again. And you never get the same focus the second time round. So that's just simple human aspect. But I think trying to judge the floor area accurately, a lot of people seem to want to have a bigger house than they actually need. And obviously the bigger the house, the more energy it's going to use, irrespective of anything else. So try to be a little bit more modest in the size of a house you want. So if you think about that 5 to 10%, if you can shrink the house down a little bit, you'll get back to where you were. And in fact, one of the good things about passive house is that you do get to use every bit of the house in a way that you don't in a normal house, because in a normal house in the wintertime you don't tend to use the spaces near windows because of the downdraft from them. The exterior walls might radiate quite a lot of cold radiation, that means you tend to huddle around the warm area. So your usable area in the house tends to shrink in the cold weather. So in a passive house, that doesn't happen. So so that's the second tip. Be modest about your floor area requirements. And third, I think the other thing for us in our projects, and the thing that we push in Passive House Homes, is there's a trio of client, architect and builder, and they need to trust and cooperate with one another. If you haven't got that relationship, it's not going to work. That's a single, I think Wolfgang Weiss might have said this to you, it's probably the most important success criteria.
And that is a perfect place to leave it in our minds. Adam, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, and thank you for inviting me.
Find out more about Adam Dadabai at passivehousehomes.co.uk. I'll also give you a link to the Passive House Handbook, this new book that's available, and that will be in the show notes. So that brings us to the end of the mini-series. I dare say that we'll be returning to this because it's pretty relevant, isn't it? And also we've hardly touched on retrofitting and the challenge that takes. We haven't really gone into much detail of the passive house techniques, but all of that in good time. I feel we need to venture off somewhere else for now. But feedback and questions, if you do have any, get them in. I haven't seen any major knife in the back of the methodology that we've been describing. No one's said, oh, this is stupid, this is ridiculous, it won't work. I was chatting to a few people in a LinkedIn group, and the main subjects and worries that they had were, it's back to cost again, how the cost of skilled labour, the cost of the components still deters quite a few of their clients that they have, if perhaps they're architects that were commenting. I can't really remember exactly, but I thought that was interesting. Hopefully in the future this will become less of an issue. But I suppose if we all work towards the best that we can do for our budget, then that's got to count for something, hasn't it? So put your comments up on houseplanninghelp.com on our website. If you do, the added bonus is I can incorporate it into the podcast. I feel a bit guilty if I'm reading some other forum comments, so we won't be doing that. Before I head out of here, I just wanted to tell you this. You know already, I should think, that I run this production company, but I'm very keen to steer my work in the direction of the construction industry, and if you have any needs for this. The reason being is the more time that I spend around people who are already experts in this industry, the better and the quicker I learn, and hopefully the more contacts I make, the better the guests I can get you. So it's quite exciting from that point of view. So if you are someone who has video needs, I think that every business, podcasting, blogging and YouTube, it's all very relevant to marketing any business. So I'll put a link in the show notes to what I do, and maybe we can help you out. How-to videos are the way forward because they establish you in the market, and that's why I'm saying if I end up doing this about construction, then I'm going to be learning too. So that would all be good. Right, I'm done. Next time on the podcast from houseplanninghelp.com, we'll be chatting to Ted Stevens. He's a really nice guy. He's got so much experience. He's been a construction journalist, also the last 4 years, chairman of the National Self-Build Association here in the UK, and loads of other stuff. I think CIFA Consulting is what he's been doing for many years, running that too. And not forgetting this, that he's built or custom built his own home. So we'll be learning from him next time. If you're looking into buying a plot of land, hold off because we may have some money-saving tips.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.